Is it fair to say that your childhood and the conditions and the experiences that you have directly create or cause ADHD, addiction, and autoimmune issues?
That's right. If you look at children in poverty or who experience racialized circumstances, they're more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD. The children of women with postpartum depression are more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD. The children of women who are stressed during pregnancy are more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD. There's no parent blaming here, but we have to recognize the importance and impact of early experiences. The diagnosis doesn't explain anything.
What do you mean the diagnosis doesn't mean anything?
Don't ask why the addiction, ask why the pain. And if you want to understand the pain, look at the person's life rather than just their genes.
Hey, it's your friend Mel. I'm so excited that you're here with me today. It is always an honor to be able to spend some time with you, to be together, to learn together. If you're brand new, I want to take a moment and welcome you to the Mel Robbins Podcast family. Super excited that you're here. And because you chose to listen to this episode, I know something about you. You're the type of person who values your time. And you're also in learning about simple ways that you can improve your own life. And I absolutely love that. And you know what I also love? I love that you and I are going to get to spend time today learning from the extraordinary Dr. Gabor Maté. He's a world-renowned physician and New York Times bestselling author and a renowned addiction expert who dives deep into childhood development and the impact of physiological and psychological trauma and how it shapes our mental and physical health over your lifetime. And today specifically, you and I are going to dive deep with Dr. Maté into how ADHD, people-pleasing, addiction, your inability to say no, and autoimmune disorders are not things that you're born with. They were created by your childhood. So please help me welcome Dr. Gabor Maté to the Mel Robbins Podcast.
Thank you.
I'm really excited about the topic today and your work around how childhood conditions and experiences in your childhood are connected to ADHD, addiction, and autoimmune diseases and disorders. And I have so many questions I want to ask you. Why don't we start with just your definition of what you're talking about when you mean childhood conditions, so that as the person is listening to us today and spending time with us together, we're all using the same words and concepts, and we kind of start on the same page.
So childhood conditions include the physical conditions, nutrition, housing, comfort, protection, but they also include the emotional conditions, which it has to do with a child's sense of being accepted or being loved, or not just as loved, but actually being seen, understood. And also on the parents' emotional states. Are the parents stressed? Are the parents struggling with economic difficulties? Are the parents carrying traumas that they hadn't worked through yet, like I had when I was a young parent? Are the parents in a marriage that's relatively peaceful, or is there a lot of conflict? Is there a lot of instability? Is there unpredictability? What kind of community support there is? Is there an extended family that can spell off the parents and give them some kind of emotional support? Are they rather isolated? Are you a single parent struggling to make a living and raise a child? So all these conditions affect the personality and the brain development of the child.
I know you wrote the original book on childhood development and ADHD, Scattered Minds, 25 years ago. It is still on the bestseller list when it comes to ADHD topics.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm going to say this correctly, but is it fair to say that your opinion is that your childhood and the conditions and the experiences that you have directly create or cause ADHD, addiction, and autoimmune issues?
Yes, along with certain genetic predispositions.
Okay.
But I can talk about genetics later, but what I want to say about them now is a predisposition is not as same as a predetermination.
Okay.
So you can have predispositions, but then depending on the environmental conditions, those predispositions can be expressed one way or another way. So you can have animals with the same genes or humans with the same genes. They'll have very different outcomes depending on the kind of conditions under which the early years were spent under. So that's what I'm saying, yes. And the first recognition of that in my life came when I was diagnosed with ADHD at age 53 or 52 or something.
So I was diagnosed with ADHD at the age of 46.
Okay.
When our son, Oakley, was going through the process of going through neuropsych evaluations for schools and IEPs. And as they were doing his evaluations, I started going, oh, wait a minute. That's a lot like me.
Yeah.
And then I went through the formal process of being evaluated and diagnosed dyslexia, ADHD.
Yeah.
And I had never, ever, ever heard anyone connect your childhood and adverse conditions or conditions where you didn't get your needs met being a contributing factor or a cause of ADHD. How is that even possible?
Well, it's possible because Western medicine separates the mind from the body. So they tend to look at things purely from a biological point of view. So ADHD is considered to be a genetic disease that you inherited. Here's the problem with that. Number one, if that's the case, why are the numbers going up? Genes don't change in a population over 10, 20, or 30 years. So something's going on in the environment that's affecting the child development. Number one. Number two, even if you look at the physiology of the child's brain, what's not understood by most physicians, because it's not taught in the medical schools, but is firmly and completely, unequivocally and uncontroversially established in brain science, is that the brain is a social product, that the brain development of the child depends on the emotional conditions under which the child lives from in utero onwards. And so that the very circuitry of the child's brain, it's programmed by the action of the environment on the genes. So different environments will act differently on the same genes. Now, if you look at ADHD, what's the medication that we give? I took it for a while. Stimulants.
Yeah.
What do stimulants do? They elevate the level of a chemical called dopamine in the brain. And dopamine is essential for motivation and therefore for focus. And that's what Ritalin and Dexedrine and Adderall and all these medications elevate. Now, the dopamine circuitry of the child's brain develops in interaction with the environment. And this is what most people who deal with ADHD just don't look at, even though it's just a pure scientific fact, you know. And a summary from Harvard University pointed out that the child's brain develops in interaction with the environment, especially the emotional relationship with the nurturing adults. Now, dopamine is a brain chemical. We have receptors for it in our brain, and receptors are molecules where the dopamine can land and do its job. The number of dopamine receptors in a child is affected by stress on the mother already in pregnancy, let alone afterwards. If you take mice and you isolate them, the number of dopamine receptors will go down. If you bring them back into companionship, the number of dopamine receptors will elevate. In other words, the brain is a social organ. It's interactive with the environment all our lives, and therefore environmental conditions affect the brain, especially during its phase of early development. It's just pure science. It's not even controversial. So the problem here is the tendency of the medical profession in which I was trained is to separate the mind from the body and to look at brain biology in isolation from the life circumstances that shape that brain biology. So that's one problem here.
So I'm going to try to distill what you just said, because I've never heard it explained quite like that. And I believe you. What you're saying is that your brain is a social organ that is developed in partnership with your relationship to the adults around you.
Exactly.
When you're literally inside your mother's womb.
Yeah.
All the way until you are, developing as a little kid.
Yeah.
And if you are in a condition, whether it is the condition of being inside your mother's womb and your mother is depressed or experiencing racism or abuse or poverty or any of these things that create chronic stress on a human being, it impacts the development of your brain.
Exactly.
And what you're also saying is that ADHD and the way that it is treated is typically through prescription drugs.
That's right.
That flood the brain with dopamine.
Yeah.
And that is what helps your underdeveloped brain, or whatever we want to call it, or the brain that's been impacted by stressful conditions during your childhood or your development in womb. And that the stressful conditions are what has interfered with the brain development.
And continues to. Now,
can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah.
So I understand that when, as a human being, you're experiencing stress, or you are experiencing a threat, or you're feeling isolated and lonely and like you're invisible, or nobody cares about you, that it switches between, that your body naturally switches from being present and in the prefrontal cortex to the amygdala taking over, and you're now in like fight or flight. When you're in fight or flight and you're kind of in that stress response state, does it interfere with dopamine?
It interferes with dopamine, it interferes with cortisol. It has an effect on the memory centers in the brain, like the hippocampus. It affects the amygdala, all those things. And if you look at children in poverty or who experience racialized circumstances, they're more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD. The children of women with postpartum depression are more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD. The children of women who are stressed during pregnancy are more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD. And there's this myth about it being genetic because it tends to run in families. Like you were diagnosed, your kids were diagnosed, I was diagnosed, a couple of my kids were diagnosed. But it's not because the so-called disease, first of all, it's not even a disease, but it's not because the so-called disease was passed on, but because the conditions that created the brain. They created your brain were also then repeated in your children's childhood as in mine. So something running in a family says nothing about genetic causation. And going back to the flight or fight thing, if a child is feeling stressed, and by the way, I think there's something genetic here, and what is genetic here is sensitivity. And the more sensitive kids are, the more they feel what's going on around them. So if the parents are stressed, the child feels the stress. Can the child escape or fight back?
No.
What do? They tune out. But when did they tune out? They tune out when their brain is developing. So that gets wired into the brain. And now they're told you got this genetic disease. No, you don't. It's an adaptation. That it began as an adaptation. And as with many of these childhood adaptations, later on they create problems. So they serve their purpose, but now they are wired in. And, not to mention, if you look at the traits of ADHD, which is the absent-mindedness, the tuning out, and then the other traits of ADHD are poor impulse regulation, which means that when you want to do something, like I might have an impulse to do something, there's nothing wrong with the impulse, but there's something wrong with me acting out the impulse. But impulse regulation depends on certain circuitry in the brain. No baby has any impulse regulation. It has to develop. For anything that's developmental, the conditions have to be right. If a plant in your backyard wasn't growing the way you expected it, you'd look at what's missing here. Nutrition, sunlight, irrigation. It's the same with kids. When they've got these challenges, let's look at the conditions that shape their development. So impulse regulation is another brain circuitry that doesn't develop well in people with ADHD, and incidentally, in people who are addicted, which is why there's such a great link between addictions and ADHD. And then the third one is, which is sometimes there, not always, hyperactivity.
Yeah.
More tends to be there more in boys.
Not girls, yep.
And regulation of the body is a function of the midfrontal cortex. That has to develop. So under conditions of stress, given that the brain is a social organ and it's also a historical organ, do you know that, does the name Bruce Perry mean anything to you?
Is he in Wisconsin?
I don't know where he is, but he's a well-known child trauma psychiatrist.
Yes, I believe he's in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, I think. But don't quote me on that. Did he write the book with Oprah Winfrey?
Yeah, he wrote the book.
Okay.
What happened to you? And he says the brain is a historical organ. So it stores the impacts of life experiences. So when we look at brain biology, let's not think that the biology is somehow distinct and separated from life experience. So there's no fault laying here. And sometimes I do get accused of blaming parents. It's the last thing I want to do.
I don't hear you blaming parents.
I
I hear
know
you
I don't,
talking very factually.
No, but there's a very well-known ADHD psychologist who goes on YouTube and says I blame parents, and I don't. Actually, I think parents do their best. They love their kids, but their best is limited by their own particular challenges and limitations. You know, there's no parent blaming here, but we have to recognize the importance and impact of early experiences. So what I'm saying is that ADHD is a result of all that stress and its impact on the brains of especially genetically sensitive kids. That's what's inherited is the sensitivity. But if there was only the sensitivity and optimal conditions, they'd never have ADHD. So it's not the ADHD that's inherited, it's the sensitivity. Now that's the good news. Because if you were a parent with a kid with ADHD, and if I was the doctor,
yeah,
and I said to you, Madam, your kid's got this genetic condition, brain biology, nothing we can do about it, but here's some medication. Or if I said to you, Mel, you know, your child's got this condition, your child's very sensitive, very responsive to the environment, and even now at age 8 or age 16 or whenever, if we can create different conditions, the brain can still develop in different ways. Which message would you rather go with?
The second.
Yeah, of course. This is a much more optimistic and much more science-based attitude. But unfortunately, again, given the dominance of pharmaceutical companies and the biological mindedness, or what they call biological psychiatry, which is just fixating on the biology and fixing it rather than looking at the conditions that shape the biology, we're very much stuck in a state where hundreds of thousands and millions of kids are being medicated. And I'm not against medications. I prescribe them, I've taken them, but they're not the answer.
What's fascinating is that when you really wrap your brain around it, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you're familiar with that metaphor. It's not the most elegant metaphor, that the genetics loads the gun.
Yeah.
But
It's
the environment that pulls the trigger, which means
Exactly.
you come into this world predisposed to certain things, but it's the environment that either deactivates or activates what you're predisposed to.
Exactly.
So that makes perfect sense. And the other thing that makes perfect sense in terms of my lived experience is being diagnosed with ADHD late in life, and also having a son and 2 daughters that have ADHD.
Yeah.
We were in Boston in a very competitive public school system, in the go, 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 both spouses working, running to the club sports, doing this, doing that, busy.
Yeah.
When we moved to southern Vermont, open space.
Amazing. Things change.
You change.
That's what I'm saying.
Because the environment changes. And if you just think about being on vacation, you leave the go of your day to day and your work and your social and all that stuff, and you step away to a space that typically has a little bit more open space and a different pace to your life, you change.
That's right.
And so I feel, because I was about to ask you, well, why does this matter to know this? But I feel that it matters deeply because if environmental conditions can shape your brain as a child, and we know that the brain develops and grows and changes through neuroplasticity through your entire life, then environmental changes, I suppose, also help you change and address these conditions.
Absolutely. And so when a family with ADHD child would come to me, once I had this recognition, I would say, well, we can consider medication in the short term if we need to, but it's not the first step. It's never should be the only step. Can we look at the family atmosphere? Can we look at the relationship between the parents? Can we look at the stresses on the family? Can you understand the child's behavior in a way that doesn't blame the child? Because these kids tend to be blamed a lot for how they behave. Now, we talk about this phrase, acting out. Kids are acting out, which usually means they're being obstreperous, oppositional, defiant, or non-cooperative, or rude, or something.
It means they're not doing what the parent wants them to do.
Yeah, but let's look at the phrase acting out. Its English meaning. We act something out when we don't have the language to say it in words. So in the game of charades, but you're not allowed to speak, what do you have to do?
Act it out.
You have to act it out. These kids' behaviors are simply acting out their emotional needs and dynamics. It's up to the parents to understand that, rather than just to respond or react to the behavior in a controlling or punitive way. Let's understand what is being acted out. which is one of the reasons I wrote that book, is I want parents to understand what is being acted out in this child's behavior. And if you change the relationship to the child's behavior will change. So it's not behavior control, it's actually promoting different conditions that'll support the child's healthy development.
You know, this reminds me of something that's always really just made me feel very heartbroken about the state of society in the world, particularly in the United States. And that is when I was going through this experience where my husband and I were having our son go through the process of all the evaluations. The school kept saying, this is behavioral behavior. And we were like, I don't think so. I don't think so.
Yeah.
And so we were in a position to be able to have him tested here in Boston at Mass General outside the school.
Yeah.
And just 3 years prior, we would not have been able to afford to do that.
I understand.
And that diagnosis and understanding that his brain and the way that he learned and the development of his brain was just different.
That's right.
And changed the trajectory of his life and my life. And before I did what I do now, earlier in my career, I was a public defender in Manhattan.
Yeah, I read that.
Doing criminal defense work.
Yeah.
The statistics of people who are incarcerated.
Yeah. With ADHD.
Yes, with ADHD, with learning differences, who were never diagnosed.
That's right.
Who, when you trace it back to what you're saying, childhood conditions,
Absolutely.
A parent who is absent, chronic
Absolutely.
racism, which is a form of trauma.
Yeah.
It makes very depressing and sad and unfair sense.
Absolutely.
And I think a lot about the fact that it's simply because we were able to, at that moment in our lives, to be able to afford a test that sent him in one direction when kids who don't have that are sent in a different one.
Yeah, we're actually hurting people for having been hurt.
Yes.
And then they act out that hurt, and then we blame them for it rather than understand what that's all about. Let me say something else. The diagnosis doesn't explain anything.
What do you mean the diagnosis doesn't mean anything?
So Mel or Gabor have ADHD. How do we know? Well, they're absent-minded, they have poor impulse regulation, and they're hyperactive. Why are they absent-minded? And of course, impulse regulation. And why do they have activity? Because they have ADHD. How do we know they have ADHD? Because they're hyperactive, they tune out, and they have impulse control. Why do they? It's circular.
Yes.
It's not an explanation. It's a description. And we mistake. Medical practice tends to mistake descriptions for explanations. They're not. If you want to know why they're hyperactive or lacking impulse regulation or tend to tune out, you got to look at their lives. As those lives acted on their genes. That's the explanation. The diagnosis describes something, but it doesn't explain anything.
But understanding this helps you also understand the role that environment and how this happened.
I think descriptions are helpful. We just mustn't mistake them for explanations. That's all.
That makes a lot of sense. You know, you mentioned addiction.
Yeah.
And there is a lot of research that shows a direct link between ADHD and addiction.
Yeah.
And what does your research and experience show about your childhood experience and conditions and the connection to addiction?
So for 12 years, I worked in Vancouver, British Columbia's downtown east side, which is North America's most concentrated area of drug use. We have more drug users there in a few square block radius than anywhere in the States or anywhere else in Canada. In fact, anywhere in Europe.
Wow.
And so I was there for 12 years. And a significant percentage of my patients clearly had ADHD that had not been diagnosed. Now, let's look at the commonalities. First of all, both addicts and people with ADHD lack impulse control. Like somebody said about addiction, is that the problem is not free will, not lack of free. No, the problem in addiction is not lack of free will, but lack of a free won't.
Lack of a free
won't.
They
have nothing to say no with because that circuitry didn't develop. Okay, number one. Number two, addictions all work on the dopamine system, which is what is affected in ADHD as well. So stimulant addicts, like crystal meth addicts, cocaine addicts, nicotine addicts, caffeine addicts, they're literally boosting their dopamine levels, which is precisely what's the issue in ADHDs as well. So if you look at the studies, something like a good 30% or more of stimulant addicts actually are diagnosable with ADHD. But again, this is studied and reported, but not much is done with it in medical practice. Furthermore, all addictions, no matter what they are, they work on the dopamine circuitry. So that I will define addiction for you.
Okay.
As manifested in any behavior in which a person finds temporary relief or pleasure and therefore craves, but then suffers negative consequences as a result of, and doesn't give up despite the harm. So craving pleasure, relief in the short term, harm, inability to give it up. That's what an addiction is. Now, let me just go sideways a little bit.
Okay.
Let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
And you've already answered it, but according to that, notice I didn't say anything about drugs. I said any behavior.
Yeah.
Now, if I speak to a room of 1,000 people and I give that definition and I say, according to that definition, which is not controversial, if you ever had an addictive pattern in your life, just raise your hand. And out of 1,999
Yes.
will raise their hands, and there's one liar who won't, but basically it's almost everybody. Now, here's the second question. And I don't care what your addictive patterns were, whether they were to alcohol, which you mentioned, or to whatever else. Not what was wrong with it, but what was right about it. What did it give you in the short term that you wanted? So what did it give you?
Oh, well, with alcohol, it was like a sense of belonging and relief, and it was a way to turn my brain off
Okay.
and to escape
Okay. When do people need to escape?
when they're stressed.
When they're suffering.
Yeah.
Okay. So the addiction wasn't a disease that you had. It wasn't your primary problem. It was an attempt to solve the problem of emotional pain and isolation. So my mantra on addiction is don't ask why the addiction, ask why the pain. And if you want to understand the pain, look at the person's life rather than just their genes. Okay? And so both people who are addicted and people who have ADHD often share these genes for sensitivity, which means they suffer more when circumstances aren't right. And so they're both, obviously those conditions will go together. And furthermore, to go back to dopamine, the shopping addict, the gambling addict, the pornography addict,
The social media addict,
the social media, and I have had my behavior
the
addictions.
gaming addiction
Yeah.
addict,
The
the
internet.
busyness.
You know what they're after? They're after a hit of dopamine in the brain, which they get through seeking that behavior.
And then you feel bad, though, that you did it.
Well, yeah, and I had my behavior addictions, but what I'm saying is it's all based partly on the dopamine circuitry. And
Which didn't develop
which didn't develop the way it should have. So now
because of your childhood.
exactly. So now you have to get your dopamine hit through pornography. And if you do brain scans on pornography addicts, they get multiple spikes of dopamine hits in their brain when they're,
Just like a drug addict.
yeah.
So what do you do with this information? Because it makes perfect sense. Like I don't know how this would be controversial. It makes absolutely perfect sense.
Well,
What do you do if you're listening to this and you yourself are recognizing this is you, or you're like, you are describing my spouse or my adult child or my parent or whomever in my life? Like, what do you do with this particular information of the connection between childhood conditions and development and ADHD and addiction?
May I just say one more thing about the brain?
Please.
Yeah, opiates.
Okay.
So people get addicted to heroin or OxyContin or Dilaudid, hydromorphone or codeine or whatever, fentanyl, unfortunately, which is a very dangerous one. These are opiates. They come from the opium plant in Afghanistan, or they're human manufactured copies of the same molecule. Now, and it's responsible for a lot of deaths in this country. Now, why